That'll be brilliant. Well, welcome everybody. We are now recording the event because we are now in session. Welcome to everybody on the line, and also welcome to those of you who might be listening to this as a recording. My name is Chris Tucker. I'm the chair of the CIPR Crisis Communications Network, and we're a recently formed CIPR group. We launched about 2 months ago, and this is, I think, now our third event. But there's something a bit different about this event. This is one of a series of events looking at the issue of climate change and the role of PR. So there are other events. I think there are about 4 or 5 more of these to come. So we're participating in that effort. Just a small housekeeping. Today's event will gain you 5 CPD points. So don't forget to record those, and the recording itself will be put up on the CIPR website once it's been edited and topped and tailed and so on and so forth. So I've got 2 guests with me today. When the CIPR asked the Crisis Network if we would participate in this series of events, I thought instantly of Paul and Sharon as 2 people who I know are very passionate, very committed, and very knowledgeable about the climate change challenge and the crisis that we face. And they're both in very, very different sectors as well. So I think we'll get quite a contrast in terms of the challenge that they face and the way that they have gone about it. So we'll hear from Sharon and Paul, and I will kick off. But I'll just do a quick introduction to each of them. I mean, Sharon first has spent most of her career working in the environment industry. Today, she is working on the issue of coastal erosion, and she works in terms of communication for Coastal Partnerships East, which is a partnership of 4 local authorities working along the Norfolk and Suffolk coast, North Norfolk District Council, Great Yarmouth Borough Council, and East Suffolk Council. So that's quite a big stretch of coast that Sharon is looking after there. And her role falls into 2 areas, really. She looks at persuading local communities and those who can make the change that they need to make the change in terms of protecting our coast and our communities. But also Sharon's had experience of dealing with those more acute crises in terms of flooding and so on, and that type of disaster emergency response. So good morning, Sharon. Nice to have you on the line today.
Good morning, Chris. Good morning, Paul, and everyone.
And then we will hear from Paul Cahalan. Paul is actually a national newspaper journalist, and we may well have many more people on the line who started their career in journalism and have now moved into communication. So obviously he's bringing those journalistic skills with him. Now, Paul's sector is the built environment, which is basically all the buildings, offices, shops, retail environments, and so on. And Paul works for Chapman BDSP, which is a leader in its field, a leading design consultancy, looking at building services, engineering and environmental design. And I know that Paul was himself actually at COP26, so I'm hoping at the end perhaps he'll give us a little bit of an overview of how he feels that went. And given that I now know this from spending time with Paul, and I've learned lots from Sharon too, that about 25% of our carbon emissions come from the built environment. So obviously Paul's job is to persuade organisations to take that seriously and make the changes in their own buildings that will help us meet that net zero challenge. So good afternoon, Paul.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much for having me, Chris.
Pleasure. Lovely to have you on the line. So I'm just going to kick off really, because from the Crisis Communications Network point of view, I wanted to look at this as a crisis challenge from a communications point of view. So climate change presents us with a particular type of challenge. So I'm looking at this here, and I'm just moving the chat box a little bit. So if you have any comments or queries, do put them in the chat box. And if you've got any questions, put them in the Q&A right at the top of the screen, and we'll get to those at the end. So some of you, I don't know, may be aware of the various theories of crisis management and how crises evolve, and that they typically develop in a linear fashion. You know, we're aware of an issue, it kind of bumps along, then something happens that makes ordinary people care about it, and then that crisis goes up that curve. So you've got this kind of linear pattern. Well, something like climate change is as we know, much more complex. And there is actually a type of crisis described as a mega crisis. And as you see here on the slide, that's a sort of unique crisis that affects every part of society, multiple publics, and requires some sort of societal and political intervention to solve it. So it's very complex. It's a factor of the way our lives are so interlinked and interconnected. The kind of mega crisis idea probably is about, I don't know, 5 or so years old. Certainly that's some of the earliest work I've seen, maybe slightly older. But probably the most obvious first one we can think of was a financial crisis back in 2007, 2008, which was very complex, showed how interlinked we are from a financial and economic point of view. Now, more recently, we're still dealing with it now, obviously, is the COVID crisis. Again, a mega crisis affects all aspects of society and affects all countries around the globe. And then, of course, we have climate change, which struck me as another obvious a mega crisis from that point of view of being very, very complex, very interlinked, very difficult to deal with. So the key differences are with this type of crisis that you need long-term solutions, clearly. These type of crises don't follow that linear kind of pattern that we're used to. They keep mutating. When we think about COVID, we can very obviously see where that concept kicks in. So that's what we're dealing with, something very complex, interlinked, affecting many stakeholders, all aspects of society and globally. So, it's clearly one of the biggest challenges we face. I mentioned the increased complexity of modern life that often lays behind these type of crises, and we can see some of these factors here. And again, we can think about them from the climate point of view, the fact that so many people live together in dense areas, increased risk of aging populations, new strains of infectious diseases that we know about, globalization of our economy and of our society, increase in international travel. Many of these do have a direct impact on climate change as well, but they do show us how interlinked we are, and therefore, climate change crisis in one part affects us in another part, and therefore we need a solution as a whole. So in terms of strategies for crisis management, when we think about climate change or any mega crisis, if we look at what's been written, there's this idea of resolving a crisis, and this is when we come to some sort of an accommodation. It might not be perfect, but we can kind of live with that. Well, obviously that's not what we could do with climate change. We can't live with it. We do need to work at it. Or we can solve it. We can do some research, and we might be lucky. Something might happen, perhaps a development in technology or medicine or something of that nature that enables us to solve it. Unlikely, because it's so big, so global, so complex. Or dissolve. And that's what I was interested in when I thought about climate change. The idea of dissolving a crisis of this kind really does require a paradigm shift, really does require the building of a new consensus, if you like, amongst stakeholders, because there are so many stakeholders, they have so many different views, so many different ways of understanding. And I think Paul may be touching on some of that with some research that he has. So we need a paradigm shift. We're not going to solve or resolve something as big and as complex as that. So as stakeholder views are so important, I thought I would look at the latest current public attitudes to climate change. And these are figures from the ONS. And if you look at the first blue tile on the far left top corner there, 3/4 of adults in Great Britain said they were worried about the impact of climate change. So we might think, as communicators, those of us who've been working in that field, we've had some success there. People know about it and they are worried about it. But then, as you see from the other tiles, if you dig down a little bit, there still are a big chunk of people who are not worried or concerned. And even among those who are concerned, sometimes their concerns are things like, as you see in that tile there, the green tile in the middle, solving climate change creates more problems than leaving it alone. Or that little aquamarine tile in the top right-hand corner there, just over 2/5 of people reported feeling anxious. Anxious, and other words that came up when there was qualitative research was, frustrated, frightened, powerless, and so on. So maybe we've created concern, but there's still a lot of people who are not quite sure what they should be doing about it. And I wondered really whether that was because as a communications community, you know, we've been using, perhaps some of us have been using this idea of fear. It's a very obvious communication approach to use. We see it used a lot. You know, we should be frightened of eating too much or drinking too much or not taking exercise. So fear is an obvious communication strategy, but to make it work, there have to be certain other parts to it. And this is a model by Witter, but basically what he's saying here is to make fear work, it has to be something that you should be afraid of. It has to be something that you feel could impact on you. And then most importantly, you need to be given something that you can do to make a difference, and how to actually make that difference. And it just got me wondering whether, when it comes to climate change, have we really been clear enough on what we can all do as individuals? What more can we look at from a communications point of view to get that idea across? And then also thinking about how people view crisis, made me think of the Ostrich Paradox. And this is I first came across this, a book by Mayer and Kenruth, I think it is, the Ostrich Paradox. It was written about 2 years ago. And those of you who look at behavioural insights will be familiar with some of these ideas. It's how we look at risk. So the idea that we are quite short term, we don't look long term, well, that makes it difficult because some of the impacts of climate change are quite a way off. We tend to look for something called, they call in the book, herding. So we look around, see what other people are doing, and if other people aren't doing very much, then we think we don't really need to do very much either. And then there's inertia. Well, you know, why now? And optimism, it might not be that bad at the end of the day. So there are lots of psychological insights I think we can take away to try and help us understand why perhaps we're not seeing as much engagement or as much actual doing among people as we might want. So I'm just going to leave you here with a sort of challenge for PR professionals as I sort of looked at it, thinking about it and talking to, you know, Sharon and Paul, and I enjoyed very much getting ready for the webinar. And it just made me realise what a huge stakeholder piece there is here to be done. And Sharon and Paul will talk about the stakeholders that they deal with, which are huge and very diverse and very different. And listening to those people is as important as telling them. We need to listen, we need to understand how they characterise climate change. And we need to talk to them in a language that they're going to understand and give them things that they can do that will make a difference. It's about building a consensus, this idea of dissolving, as it were. If we're going to make some kind of paradigm shift that affects the way we all live our lives, that's a huge piece of work, and we need to build a consensus behind that. And then just finally, the point of the mirror, and we were just talking about this before we went online today, you know, as PR professionals, very often our job is to hold up a mirror to our organisations, particularly those who might be wanting to make green claims or think that they're actually making a difference. Are you really doing that? PR isn't just about communicating, it's also about being an activist and helping to bring about change. So just a few of my thoughts there in terms of climate change as a crisis communication challenge. And we're now going to take with Sharon, who's actually doing this now and every day. So Sharon, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. As Chris said, my career is in coastal management, and that's coastal change, so erosion and flood risk. So I'm going to just take you through a little bit of that. So the Global Risk Report 2020 stated that extreme weather is the most likely risk we face. So to put that into context, between 12 and 76 centimetres of sea level rise is predicted by 2100, and that's set to continue to rise beyond 2100 under all climate predictions. The data around flood risk in terms of severity and frequency, that data has been gathered for decades, but the data around the impacts of coastal change, so coastal erosion, is not quite so reliable. There are 96 coastal local authorities covering more than 11,000 miles of coast in the United Kingdom, and we're all roughly in the same position, often with minimal communications resource and rarely with communications resource dedicated to flooding and coastal change. So those communications teams are actually massively stretched, dealing with the business of the broader business of the council, which could be anything from when your bins are getting collected, rather than actually being dedicated to something that is a growing issue. Added to that is the fact that we are lacking really good data nationally to understand the size of the problem. So we're in fact estimating the scale of the crisis in terms of coastal change. We don't truly know the size of the problem that we're facing at the moment. So next slide, please, Chris. So the evidence of a changing climate is visible on the coast to those who work, live and visit there. In 1953, was the largest event recorded for the largest event recorded. Over 350 lives were lost in the United Kingdom, and sadly 1,500 lives were lost in the Netherlands. It was a really difficult time to have an event of this nature, because if you consider from a communications perspective, the ability to warn people, to let them know, we take for granted nowadays social media, the immediacy of news now on digital channels. There was none of that in 1953. The radio was the best form of communication. There was no flood warning service, and very few flood defences in the United Kingdom or in the Netherlands. So since then, we've seen smaller tidal surge events, notably in the late 1970s, but more recently, the East Coast had significant surges in 2007, 2013, of course, 2017 and 2018. Our summers are getting hotter and drier, and that impacts upon the sandy cliffs that we have in Suffolk and Norfolk. And the winters are wetter and windier with increased tide heights and wave action. Added to the fact that in this area, so across Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex, we have the fastest eroding cliffs in Western Europe. And where we're not eroding, the land is sinking. So we have a really complex situation in terms of that coastal erosion added to an increased level of flooding. And it's clear that these extreme events where high tides combined with surge tides and high winds are getting more frequent, and how we manage our response preparing for and during an event is becoming ever more critical. So next slide, please, Chris. So I'd like to briefly touch on a recent event, the 2013 event that shaped our current climate response. So just to set the scene a little bit, the deterministic forecast, so that is the forecast that is used by the Met Office and the Environment Agency and comes about 36 hours before an event hit, didn't actually reflect the full scale of the impacts, but we were aware that the event was going to be significant. So the impacts were felt right across the Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex coast, and in fact beyond that into Lincolnshire and further north. Many homes and businesses were flooded, and some businesses in Lowestoft, so that's the most easterly town in the UK, unfortunately never traded again. The impacts were so great. Now, the crisis communications response wasn't fully embedded across all partners at a local level. At a regional and national level, it was embedded well, and we were very grateful for that, but locally, not quite so well. And listening to one of the presenters, Joe, last week at the first Crisis Communications Network webinar, and if you didn't see it, really it's worth going back and having a look when it's available. He set out how the New Zealand government uses the Mayfield model as part of their COVID-19 response, and that really resonated with me. It was absolutely fascinating because this has been applied to flood incident management comms and applied highly successfully, and I hadn't really considered that previously. But we use that model to make sure that our communities know what they need to do, why they need to do it, and they feel that they're understood and listened to, because in some cases that might mean evacuation, and that's critical. We're talking about a risk to life here. So we also took that model and promoted that with local radio, and they successfully adopted that approach, broadcasting live over the 24-hour period. Now, I've been working in communications and public relations for about, well, just over 30 years. And it's the first time I've really seen the media just quite honestly broadcast entirely factually. And they worked very closely with the Environment Agency, who I was working for at the time. And that 24-hour period was really critical to the community. So using that model with a media partner worked very well. And of course, after that crisis, reflecting on how it's managed is critical. And an area we identified during the incident recovery and evaluation was that locally, communities actually expected that visibility. And we know with our crisis communications response that that's actually critical. And they expected that from those that they trusted. They didn't feel that they'd had that on the ground. That created, because those crisis communications plans locally weren't fully developed, there was some confusion around this. But post-event, that crisis communications response for flooding has been amended and using those lessons learned. So it's far more reflective of what we would expect to see from the 5 C's. So concern, clarity, control, competence, confidence, particularly around that competence, that visibility of either technical experts or our CEO at the time on the ground would have actually helped our community significantly and is now embedded. So next slide, please, Chris. So the events of COP26 have brought climate change into stark focus again. But as an island nation with those 11,000 miles worth of coast, the loss of homes and businesses, and in some cases, sadly, whole communities is now really an increasing risk. So at the first webinar, again, referring to that, but it was really great. I would recommend watching it. So the first webinar of the Crisis Communications Network, one of the highly engaging speakers there mentioned the National Risk Register. Now, this is particularly critical for local authorities and category 1, so those blue light responders. So it translates to how risks are managed at a local level through the community risk registers. And those risk registers then influence the resilience forum plans and the crisis communications response plans. Now, interestingly, it mentions very briefly coastal erosion, but it doesn't actually the risk register doesn't actually categorize it as a high enough risk to figure on the risk matrix. And those are the things, as I said, that make a difference to those community risk registers. This means that crisis response has to be managed at a local authority level. And that's often without the structure of a crisis communications response plan. Now, with the speed of information, we know this, everyone on the call, I'm sure, knows this through social and digital media, that crisis can grow and overtake very quickly indeed. And that's going to impact upon the ability to manage both operational and communications crisis with the available resource. We experienced this very recently as 2018 and the Beast from the East. That made a significant difference when we lost about 13 homes in Norfolk over the edge of a cliff. So given the lack of firm data at a national and local level means that the scale of the problem isn't fully appreciated. And recent reports by the IPCC and COP26 are highlighting that this is in fact a growing risk. Chris, next slide, please. So that should be, I think we should be on slide 5, sorry. Chris, I think you've got the wrong, that's okay, we can use that one. So sorry, I do apologize, it's a slightly different slide, but that's okay. So just looking at sort of a recap on where we are. So we've got missing data from a coastal erosion perspective. The threat of coastal change is growing. We know the sea level is rising. Key national strategies acknowledging that adaptation and resilience are critical. So if we look at the Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy 2050, that's DEFRA's strategy that informs how we manage the coast. It says we can't defend all of our island nation. And what we mean by that is there's often not a technical solution that will allow us to do that. So national policy doesn't reference coastal change, coastal erosion. So that doesn't support us in terms of crisis management response. And we can't defend everywhere. So next slide, please, Chris. So what are we going to do? So in the face of those challenges, we look to manage our issues before they become a crisis. We innovate in our communications response and the tools we have in our armory. We look at new ways of working with and preparing our communities to transition them to greater resilience. Now you'll see in the top right-hand box there is a snippet of an article that I struggle with a little bit. This was Emma Howard-Boyd, who's chair of the Environment Agency, and she recently published this article entitled Adapt or Die. And her sentiment is absolutely correct. She's quite right. Adaptation is absolutely critical to what we're going to do. But you have to ask yourself the impact, what impact has that actually had on those that are receptors of that message, who might actually be looking out of their window tomorrow morning at an eroding coastline that's going to take their home. So this is about us as communicators thinking about when we communicate out, how does that message resonate with those that it impacts upon? And considering that came from the chairman of one of the organisations in the country that has a strategic overview of that didn't sit particularly well with a number of us in the industry. So we need to look at new ways of working with our community. So this is more than an operational response. This is relying on communication skills to work at the heart of the issue. A sense of place and investment in a particular way of life and impacts upon mental health and well-being are all things that we need to consider. So I'm going to reflect on and paraphrase Sir David Attenborough quite considerably here at COP26. So to me, communications now is the answer to a changing climate on our coast. This is our time to actually support our operational colleagues who are tied by technical difficulties. So very recently, the DEFRA launched the Innovative Resilience Fund. Now that's a £125 million fund for risk management authorities, and in Norfolk and Suffolk we have been granted £8.4 million. That's the biggest single award to develop tools from finance models for those that are facing adaptation in the future through to communications responses. Now the tools we're developing will support not only a local response but actually those other 93 local authorities that are working with their communities around England. So this is about equipping the whole country to help coastal communities to transition. That's going to include baselining and resilience. Now, as communications professionals, we know how incredibly important evaluation is. Well, you can't increase resilience in a community if you don't know where you're starting from. So we've been working with the London School of Economics and the Zurich Flood Alliance to bring that baselining toolkit into the United Kingdom. It's been used throughout the globe to baseline third world countries through to developed urban areas in Germany, and we've now trialled it in the UK. This was showcased at COP26 as a good point to understand that changing climate, its implications, and how ready a community is to deal with that. We're co-creating a behavioural change toolkit. Now, when I say co-creating, Chris alluded earlier to making sure that actually you are reflecting the people who are facing these issues. Now, our communities on the coast are galvanising themselves into groups. But what they're struggling with is they are the same issue we are struggling with. They are very much in a position where they can change the minds of those that are immediately impacted but are struggling to achieve a societal change. So we're going to be using virtual reality tools and creating visitor rooms to engage with demographics that we've not previously been able to, those 18 to 25 and 35 to 45. Co-creating engagement tools with communities at risk so that they're able to use it and we're able to engage properly, and co-creating products such as augmented reality and gaming technology with students at an FE level who can help communicate to that younger generation and leave us with a legacy. So next slide, please, Chris. So just a final sort of bit of a lessons learned. And I was fortunate enough to have Chris as my tutor recently for a crisis communications diploma. And actually this stuck with me. This is Amanda Coleman, and that's the scale of the crisis really doesn't matter. It's whether it's a crisis to you. And this really resonates at a local authority level when we consider the fact that coastal erosion isn't considered nationally as a high enough risk, but we've got to treat it as an emerging crisis. So I would say be brave. Don't take it for granted that national policy reflects the current climate challenge. It was probably written by civil servants significantly a number of years previously and might not have been updated. Be ready to influence that change. Senior decision makers need to understand the critical nature of baselining of data and evaluation. It's not just about jumping into a communications response. It's about understanding where you're taking it from to achieve the best outcome. And it's not your crisis. You might be managing it, but its impact is felt by others. So it's being brave enough to ask them now, before it happens, how would you like us to work with you? And behavioural change can support incident management. It's going to support that response that you're going to get from your community or in other sectors, your clients. Be clear, but be very clear about what it is you're seeking to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Apologies if I transposed a couple of your slides there, but you managed that brilliantly. Some really interesting points there. Some of you may have heard of the 5 C's model that we talk about in terms of crisis communication, compassion, clarity, competence, etc. But it was interesting, Sharon, you were saying that you've got to actually translate those into what that means. Like for you, when you were dealing with flood, it meant visibility. No good sounding competent. People wanted to see people on the ground who were competent in their local communities. I thought that was really interesting. And then this adapt or die, but was that a bit of fear, do you think? But without the other bits that I talked about?
I think so. And I can understand where that came from, but it's just sometimes you need to consider that how that message is being felt by those that I've read it with horror, because I know that there are communities in Hemsby who are so incredibly close to the cliff edge, for whom that would actually be maybe another night of no sleep.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the two-way communication, I know you're familiar with. Some comments just before we go to Paul from Hayley here. Hayley, having grown up in Lowestoft on the East Coast, always been aware of flood and erosion damage. The home my mother grew up in is no longer there.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, Hayley. That must be awful.
So really understanding there what the impact is on local communities.
It's the loss. It is almost the 7 stages of grief you go through when you lose a home. Hayley, I'm so sorry. That must have been awful for her.
Terrible to see that is the impact that it's having. Thank you, Sharon. That was brilliant. So, Paul, over to you. Let's see if I can get the slides right this time.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks, Sharon. Just what you said there just brings home to me the impact. So I was at COP, and there was a lot of talk about the global south and who's suffering from the crisis, and we can see that it is coming to our doorstep. And I think that fight or flight and the immediacy and putting the crisis in order of priority, it's a really interesting debate. And I just for my bit, I just wanted to focus on 3 areas that I would hope would help a practitioner understand a little bit of context, and not knowing what world you're in or who you're trying to influence or what you're trying to understand. I just thought I'd tackle it tackle the issue as a challenge, a crisis, or an emergency, understanding that as the risk, and what's the opportunity for you to get involved and influence your organization or people that you're trying to work with. Then I just wanted to bring it into my world to show you what's happening in the built environment and what we're trying to do, and hopefully that gives you some prompts as well. And then lastly, just throw it back out to you along the lines of Sharon and Sir David Attenborough, and yeah, a quick romp through, but then if there's any questions, I'm happy to take any afterwards. So just moving on, Chris, I was at COP, and there's a massive juxtaposition with those who are making the decisions and those who are feeling the decisions. And we're going to see this come into focus a lot more. And at the minute, it's very much through figureheads like the activists, and we all know about Interlink Britain or Greta Thunberg. But there are things happening that are creating movement. So just I've put a couple of them up there. And finance is a really key area because it unlocks the levers for change. So there was a package announced. Mark Carney, the former Bank of England chief, spearheaded this group that has now committed to £95 trillion worth of money in those assets being tied to green Paris Agreement levels. So what does that mean? What does that mean for you? How do we use that? And then the second thing that happened was there's a real move, and you will have seen it, and apologies if I'm teaching some of you to suck eggs or not, the move to ESG reporting. Some of it is mandatory now and is going to be increasingly as we go forward. But by 2023, if you're in an investor-led community, particularly finance, legal, insurance, all of your assets and all of your funding will be tied to green finance that is proven to be in line with sustainable development goals, in line with disclosure reporting. So that is, if you think about that as a risk to your business and what you do as a practitioner or a communicator, I think that's the way to look at it. So if you're looking at how do I influence change, how do I build a business case, what are the risks for us as a business, I think there's two things. So there's the risk of climate change to your business and your supply lines, depending on which area in which you work. What does climate change mean? If there's massive flooding in London or in Europe or wherever you are, how does that affect your supply chains? How does it affect your business as usual? But then there's also the external risk. So are you a responsible business? Are you part of this movement that is showing that it is responding to the greatest challenge that we're all facing? Now, whether you agree that it's the greatest challenge or not is a moot point, because the carrot and the stick is there from government and from all sectors of society and from all sectors of governance. And I'm just going to touch on that very quickly for you in the next slide. So what I found was, if you just move it on, Chris, thank you. We do a lot of work here around what our competitors are doing and where we feel we've got an edge. And I just asked one of my friends at Signal AI, John Fox, he put these together for us just to show you the sentiment and the relevance of the climate debate as we move through. So this slide is just showing you in the run up to COP, the volume on the axis there are the number of articles in national and trade media in the UK and Europe talking about COP against those four topics, so carbon neutrality, greenwashing, etc. And you can see there's some points in there where it spikes. But if you look at the next slide, just as we go into COP and just as we start talking about the debate, you can see the negative sentiment has risen, and you can see the volume has just vastly changed. And some things behind that were Greta Thunberg speaking. The Telegraph ran another front page on we need a referendum on net zero. Boris Johnson was caught in a row over flying back from COP to go and speak to go to the Garrick Club and meet a climate denier. And all of these things added to the sentiment. And then just lastly there, just to show you how public sentiment is carrying across. Some activists put ban fracking now. They projected it onto the Armadillo building in Scotland, in Glasgow, where the conference was being held. And that caused a lot of traction and negative sentiment. So these are some of the tools that you can use as a practitioner when you're looking at it, depending on the world you've worked in. But for me, there are ways for you to start looking at this and building a case for how you go forward, plot risk, plot the challenge and the opportunity. And even a simple pestle and SWOT type scenario will go a long way to helping you. So if we go to the next slide, please, Chris. What we're finding, this move to ESG has already started, and in some sectors, it's the private sector that is leading it, not government, but private sector said, look, we've got to get ahead of this. And so the task force for climate disclosure was something that was set up from the private sector. It's linked to the sustainable development goals that the UN have got for 2030. And just here, it's just to give you an idea that there are these metrics out there that are trying to move companies to being responsible ESG reporting companies. Now, the ESG, the S part is social value, and in all public sector contracts, you now must have a social value element to win that contract. So it means that it's weighted on you providing local solutions that localities want if you're going to get anywhere near this public sector money. So the real shift that I saw from COP was this move from intent to proofing. It's not good enough to say, you know, you are like us and we really want to be seen as the people to be on this journey with you. No, what have you done? How are you putting this into practice in your community? What are you doing with your suppliers? How are you going to be the responsible business we can work with? So it's a really interesting shift. And the key thing with disclosure is you only measure what matters, but once you disclose, that's what changes behavior. And it's investor-led at the minute, but society is coming up from the other way and demanding these changes as well. So if you're not on the bus, you need to be, and if not, it's a material risk to your business, I would suggest. So just on the next slide again, I was just going to talk to you about the built environment. So I work for Chapman BDSP. We're a SME, we're a consultancy, so we sit in the middle of the food chain. We've got clients who have got huge resources. They're on an ESG journey and they want to incorporate it into their purpose, into their vision, and we help them do that by helping them make their buildings efficient, but also talking to them about how they can be seen as leaders in their sectors, and that's part of the consultancy stuff. It means we have to proof what we're doing, because if we're not being the responsible business, how can we legitimately give advice upwards and downwards? So we recognize that, so we started a charter. We've got science-based targets, but it is not enough. Like collectively, that is not going to make a difference to the problem. And the built environment industry has been responding to that. It's been working in silos, but at the Built Environment Day at COP, there was an announcement which moved things on significantly, and hopefully it's something that as practitioners you guys could have a look at it and think about how you could apply it in your world. So that on the next slide, Chris, hopefully you can see there the net zero whole life carbon roadmap. It sounds like a mouthful, but it's been produced by industry collaboration over 9 months with professionals in different sectors. And what the UKGBC have done, the UKGBC is a charity, but it's sort of the moral voice for a greener built environment. And it has brought all of these different players and actors together and created a roadmap, but also created a technical policy document, a document for policymakers, and a stakeholder action plan. So it's defined all of the groups, it's defined the sector, which is incredibly complex, but as a sector, we contribute to 1/4 of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. So the moral imperative is there, but also UKGBC have phrased it as the opportunity, and it's pointed out the gaps, and it's pointed out where government legislation needs to come on board with some of the things we're trying to do. But on the next slide, just to give you an idea of how it breaks down. So we're in the building services engineering world in Chapman BDSP, and it's given us, you know, these are the immediate actions for you. They define our group as a key change agent. So it gives us that agency. Here's some actions you have to have by 2025. This is what you need to do by 2030, but there's proof points along the way. So yes, it's not tackling the bigger issues of you know, fossil fuels, GDP as a measure of wealth, but in our world, here's a plan, here's how we do it. So it's been a real step forward for us as an industry. And just if you move on to the next one, please, Chris. how that applies to us is, here's 3 of our clients, and I just wanted to show you this because these are testimonials on the roadmap, but the bits in red show you how it relates back to our world and profit and loss. So all of those comments in red are around emissions created by our supply chain, leveraging our value, leveraging our own value chain. So what we do as a responsible business is help our clients reach their ESG goals by making sure we are ISO 14001 compliant. We've got modern slavery, all of the things that you tick off as policy credentials. They're so important now. And if you're not on that trajectory, you're not going to be working with the clients at the top of the food chain. And likewise, people you work with, for you to meet your ambitions for ESG, they have to be on this same journey as well. So the takeaway is every business is now a net zero business. And if you're not, the carrot has gone, the stick is coming from government. So just moving that on again, Chris, I hopefully can tuck into that a bit. So in my world, the legislation is fast following. I won't bore you with the detail, but just as a practitioner, work out what consultations have government got out? What is industry doing in your sector? What is coming over the hill? And one of the things I just wanted to touch on for you is, though it might not be mandatory at the minute, you will find leaders in your world creating benchmarks and measures for being those responsible businesses. And the logo you can see there that says next on it is the next generation, and it is a benchmark for the house building sector. So if you just move it on one more, Chris, it will show you, hopefully you can see that. So this is an industry-led initiative, voluntary at the minute. The 25 top house builders in the UK are being judged on their sustainability criteria. And if you can read that, I'm not sure if you can, but basically under governance, it is asking, do you have a sustainability vision that is integral to the company and its performance? It's asking, do your board members, are they remunerated and compensated on their sustainability KPIs? That is a massive shift. And as I say, it's voluntary, but you can see the direction of travel. And if you see the executive governance body for that includes Lloyds Bank. So when you're a house builder and you want to go to a Lloyds Bank or any of the big lending institutions, you need to be meeting those ESG targets. And take that back to Rishi Sunak's announcement and Mark Carney's announcement about 95 trillion being locked into green finance and Paris 1.5 agreement targets. You begin to see how quickly this is going to change. So just moving on again, Chris, here's the proof in the pudding. These are the published results from that benchmarking. So once this measurement is out there, it changes and influences behavior. And that's the key. If we're talking about behavioral change, nudge units and everything else, the first thing is the measurement and the benchmarking. Then you can look at the change, because that is what influences a change. And the disclosure gives you accountability, responsibility and consequences, which is the other side of it. Again, all goes into risk. So just to leave you with, Chris, I was just going to come back to Sir David Attenborough, and very helpfully for us communicators, Sir David Attenborough has now put saving the planet on our shoulders. Thanks very much, David. But I've written about this before, and it's sort of how Chris and I got to talking about this subject. For me, there's a massive similarity between Brexit and climate change. The Telegraph front page again around, do we need a referendum on net zero, sort of shows you it's coming up. Who pays for this? What's the taxpayer-led arguments for doing this? Is it our issue? Is it someone else's issue? And if you think about sort of the Brexit themes around project fear, and if you think around, you know, the sort of zealots and the other side, you know, the sort of moral crusading and the hypocrisy, and even themes around catastrophizing, and, you know, we're creating a whole load of anxiety that's not there. Wherever you sit on the debate, I think it's worth looking at those similarities, because that can help influence what you do next as a practitioner, but also where you think the debate might go, and get ahead of that curve. So when I wrote about this, I was sort of had it as a think, feel and act in terms of dealing with a crisis. So for this one, just thinking about it in terms of Brexit, or is it like it or not, and how do we define it, is a place I started. And then just on the feeling it, you can see from what Sharon presented how this is impacting local communities now. This isn't a global south problem somewhere, you know, lower than the equator. This is real and immediate. It might not feel it at the minute. Boris Johnson talks about the pandemic of coronavirus being the invisible killer. It's not. There are people in hospitals. It's very much with us. Climate change, by definition, is weather patterns over a long period of time, decades. So you can't feel that immediacy, but it's here. And the difference with this is, if you don't grasp it now, it gets to a point where you can't row back. And that's the bit as communicators we need to get across. And then just lastly, on the ACT bit, I was in COP, I was challenged by lots of stuff. You know, the youth didn't have a voice, the global south didn't have a voice, they're most affected, all of the arguments at various different levels. And just in terms of acting and thinking about climate change as an issue, as an emergency, as a risk, as a response to a crisis, maybe a starting point is this the most important conversation you will ever have? And that was something that was raised. And if you think about all of the things we get involved with, whether it's stuff around diversity, equality, inclusion, whether it's stuff around gender, whether the CIPR runs all of its courses on everything it does, in terms of a hierarchy, where does this sit as a material risk to the industry, to our lives, to the planet? And I think just thinking about that and how you get involved and how you communicate that is the question. I'm not having an answer on it. I'm just throwing it out there in terms of acting on a personal, industry and wider level. When we think about it like that, it brings home, I think, some of the issues and the complexity around it. But yeah, that's all really what I wanted to leave you with, and I'm happy to take any questions, and thanks for your time.
Brilliant. Thank you, Paul. See, I told you they were passionate advocates who work hard in their areas. So thank you. That was really interesting, Paul. Just a couple of things sort of jumped out at me. I love that quote from you. Every business is now a net zero business. And because you're talking about two lots of risks, the risk to the planet that we know about, but the risk to your business if you're not on that bus, as you say. Yeah,
well, I mean, risk is relative, right? So if it hits you in the profit and loss, and if it hits you this week, it feels immediate. We only deal with risk when it's in front of us. I mean, for the majority of people. And I think if you think of it as an opportunity that every business is a net zero business, whether you agree with the catastrophizing of climate change or wherever you sit, the opportunity there is to be on that journey with your clients and in your institutions. And if you don't want to be on that journey, that's fine. But I think you'll find that most people will be on it. So how are you going to interact with that? And where's your place in the world if you don't do this stuff? And for some people, it might be business as usual. But in my world, if we're not reacting to this, it's from a business profit and loss and a risk side, there's going to be a huge impact.
Excellent. Thanks, Paul. Really interesting insights there. Sharon, I can see you've been interacting with Sasha there. I was asking about the toolkit that you talked about, which sounded fascinating. Maybe it'd be something you could write about for us at some point in the future.
Yeah,
that'd be interesting.
More than happy to. I've responded to Sasha that I'm happy to keep her informed, but actually if she's on the Kent coast, there might be an opportunity to perhaps work with us to think about developing that, so we've got another geographical areas view as we're developing the toolkit.
Fantastic. That would be great. It's lovely to hear about using new technologies to engage young people and different stakeholder groups, because as we were saying, this affects all stakeholders and we need to find the right messages and the right channels. There's also a question here that we had from Catherine. If national risk policy does not recognise or include coastal erosion, what contingency plans has the government made for Sizewell B, which is situated on the Suffolk coast? And why is it planning to build Sizewell C? Well, that's very specific, Sharon, but what's your view on that?
Well, I've just responded to Catherine. The issue with Sizewell, the issue with Sizewell B and now C is not a risk of coastal change, coastal erosion per se. It's a flood risk issue. And that is obviously included very strongly in the National Risk Register. And there are robust plans that EDFE have put forward. But I've said to Catherine for reassurance that Coastal Partnership East, on behalf of East Suffolk Council, we've reviewed all the plans. And I've said I'd happily, it's a massively complex process, and I'm happy to talk to Catherine about that offline because it's very, very specific. But just a bit of reassurance, not only have we worked with EDFE and reviewed their plans, we've also brought together all of the local coastal communities, got their views and included them in our response to EDFE. So it is quite a broad involvement. So I've arranged to talk to Catherine offline if she'd like to.
Fantastic. Sharon, I've just seen, actually, I should have reminded you and Paul, if you're using the chat box to tick everyone, you'll remember that from diploma days, and I forgot. Unfortunately, Sasha couldn't see your response, but just to let you know, Sasha, Sharon is going to keep you informed. You work for the Kent Resilience team. Oh, that's relevant, isn't it, Sharon?
It is.
What you're doing, and she's given her email address, which I'm going to, in case you can't see it, Sasha, I'm going to write that down so we can get back to you on that.
Yep.
Can you see that?
Yeah, I've noted your email, Sasha, and
Fantastic.
I will most definitely be in touch. Thank you very much.
Just see the check if we've got any other Q's and A's, nothing else there. So I just have one final question for Paul, really, one other note I made on your presentation. It sounds very inside out, doesn't it, in terms of we need to sort ourselves out in terms of the organisations we work for before we start talking to other stakeholders about what they ought to be doing. It sounds as if at Chapman that's what you've done. You started with yourself so that you know you're in the right place before you go out to your clients. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it's a bit amorphous, you know. Some of it's led by clients, some of it we're trying to see what we can do. We don't have all the answers. I mean, it is such a complex, multifaceted issue at, you know, national stakeholders down to local clients and supply chains, that what we're trying to do is just sort of convene, help people talk and create the space and the tools and the models to go forward with stuff. So yeah, I think it's just, and there's still, I would say, a massive the massive gap is the communications gap, that we have tools to deal with some of the solutions, but who are the best people equipped to try and tell that story? When are we trying to speak to the audiences, and how? And going back to that comment around adapt or die, you know, what is the best way to provoke a positive reaction, or a reaction that gets people to feel the issue so that it influences their change decisions? Because, you know, once you've lived through 2 years of a pandemic of coronavirus, climate change doesn't seem that bad at the minute. And well, that's I think
it's a short term, long term, isn't it? Yeah. Right, one last question before we close. Question for you, Sharon. Do you think business involved in the build community should, I think actually it's Paul. Do you think businesses involved in the build community should invest more in work with communities around community resilience and readiness, preparing for climate change? As it does cross both your areas, Paul. So how can the built environment help Sharon's world?
2 ways, I think. Come up with those solutions that unlock the innovation and the funding that allow you to create positive messages for some of that change. But I think also look at the UK GBC roadmap and try and apply bits of that elsewhere, pick it apart and say where it doesn't go far enough. Or so there are models there for you to get started and to be on a journey in whatever sector you're in. And then that gives you the way to advocate for change at government level and say, you know, legislation's not pushing hard enough or not in the right direction. So I think it's everyone getting behind the idea that, yes, we must do something, but actually here's how. And so, yeah, I think we could just talk.
And it's about building this consensus, isn't it? So fantastic. Brilliant, everybody.
Is it okay to just add to that a little bit? Because there isn't a group of people called Business in the Community. They're a national organisation that has local branches that are linked to the Prince's Trust. They're actually funded through the Prince's Trust. And this is a group of businesses that can offer advice to other businesses. So you've got the likes of Marks and Spencer's and Aviva and, you know, the big hitters in there. They provide mentors to businesses and who in turn work with other businesses and communities to help them increase their resilience plans. So business plays an enormous part in helping with resilience, and anybody who works with business or is a business and would like some help with resilience, go to your either regional office of business in the community or look at the national website, because there are loads of tools you can get involved in and loads of opportunities for developing that resilience.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Paul and Sharon. I've really enjoyed working with you and pulling today together. I hope everybody on the line and those listening to the recording have found it interesting and useful as well. Crisis Communications Network will be back, I think, in the new year. We've got some super events that I can't tell you about at the moment, but they're jolly exciting. So do follow us on Twitter at CIPR Crisis Comms, or you can find us obviously on the website and sign up to the network via your profile on the CIPR. Thank you very much. Take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.